She collapsed in the snow. Then a painted wolf led her to a hidden fire. The wind cut through Elena Ramirez's jacket like a blade, carrying snow that stung her face and obscured the trail markers she'd been following since dawn. The Chiricahua. Mountains of southeastern Arizona weren't supposed to be this brutal in early December, but the weather system that had swept down from Colorado had brought with it the kind of storm that old-timers warned could kill the unprepared. Elena pulled her GPS from her backpack with numb fingers, cursing when the screen showed no signal. She'd been documenting Apache cultural sites for her doctoral thesis in anthropology, specifically focusing on winter camps that had been used by Geronimo's band in the 1880s. The University of Arizona had granted her permission to access this remote area of the Coronado National Forest, but she hadn't anticipated being caught in a blizzard that seemed to have materialized from nowhere. Her boots crunched through snow that was now ankle-deep, and she could feel the cold seeping through her supposedly waterproof hiking gear. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees since morning, and the wind chill made it feel even colder. Elena had grown up in Tucson, where winter meant mild days and cool nights, not this bone-deep cold that seemed to leach the strength from her muscles. She paused beside a large boulder, trying to get her bearings. The landscape that had been so clear and navigable 6 hours ago now looked alien and hostile. Every rock formation, every cluster of oak and pine trees looked the same through the swirling snow. The trail she'd been following had disappeared entirely, covered by accumulating powder that showed no trace of human passage. Elena's hands shook as she pulled out her phone, hoping against hope for even one bar of signal. Nothing. The screen showed a battery level of 30%, and she quickly turned it off to conserve power. Her water bottle had started to freeze, creating slushy ice that was difficult to drink, and she realized with growing alarm that she was showing early signs of hypothermia. Her thinking felt sluggish, and she had to consciously focus on each decision. Find shelter, stay warm, signal for help if possible. The basic survival protocols her wilderness safety course had drilled into her seemed academic now, faced with the reality of a high-altitude winter storm. The snow was falling harder, thick, flakes that accumulated on her shoulders and backpack. Elena's GPS unit was useless without satellite coverage, and her paper map was becoming difficult to read in the whiteout conditions. She estimated she was somewhere in the vicinity of the old Apache strongholds, areas where Geronimo and his followers had hidden from the U.S. Army over a century ago. Those same rocky outcroppings and hidden canyons that had provided refuge for Apache warriors might now be her only hope for survival. Elena forced herself to move, knowing that stopping for too long in these conditions would be fatal. Her legs felt heavy, and each step required conscious effort. The altitude, combined with the cold and her growing exhaustion, was taking its toll. As she struggled up a steep slope, Elena's foot slipped on ice hidden beneath the snow. She fell hard, her backpack cushioning the impact but jarring her enough that she lay still for several moments, watching snowflakes land on her jacket. The cold seeped through her clothing, and she felt a dangerous lethargy creeping over her. Getting back up required enormous effort. Elena's movements were becoming clumsy, and she recognized the signs of advancing hypothermia. Her core body temperature was dropping, and soon her ability to make rational decisions would be compromised. She needed to find shelter immediately, or she wouldn't survive the night. Elena's legs gave out as she crested a ridge, and she collapsed face first into the snow. The cold burned against her exposed skin, and she struggled to push herself up. But her arms felt like lead weights. Panic fluttered in her chest as she realized she might not have the strength to continue. The storm showed no signs of abating, and darkness was beginning to fall across the mountains. She rolled onto her back, staring up at the gray sky through the falling snow. This wasn't how she'd imagined her research would end. Elena thought of her grandmother, who had encouraged her academic pursuits and would be devastated to learn that her granddaughter had died alone in the wilderness, pursuing knowledge about a culture that wasn't even her own. As hypothermia tightened its grip, Elena's vision began to blur, She was dimly aware of movement in her peripheral vision, but when she turned her head, she saw nothing but wind-sculpted snow and dark tree trunks. Her mind was playing tricks on her, she knew, but the sensation of being watched persisted. Then, she saw it clearly. A wolf standing about 30 feet away, watching her with intelligent amber eyes. But this wasn't an ordinary wolf. Its fur bore distinctive markings, painted symbols in red and black ochre that seemed to glow against its gray coat. Elena blinked hard, certain she was hallucinating, but the animal remained, solid and real, against the white landscape. The painted wolf approached slowly, showing no fear or aggression. It circled her once, then sat in the snow and tilted its head, as if assessing her condition. Elena tried to speak, but only managed a weak croak. The cold had numbed her lips and tongue, making coherent speech impossible. After what felt like an eternity, the wolf stood and began walking away, pausing after several steps to look back at her. When Elena didn't move, it returned and nudged, her shoulder gently with its muzzle. The message was clear. "Follow me." Summoning reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, Elena struggled to her feet. The painted wolf waited patiently as she gathered her backpack, then began moving. Across the snow-covered terrain with purposeful strides, Elena followed, her boots sliding in the wolf's tracks, using the animal's trail to maintain her footing on the treacherous ground. They traveled for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the wolf occasionally stopping to ensure Elena was still behind it. The animal seemed to know exactly where it was going, navigating through boulder fields and dense stands of pine with confidence. Elena's conscious mind kept insisting this was impossible, that she was experiencing severe hypothermic hallucinations. But her survival instinct told her to follow wherever this strange guide was leading. The wolf led her to a narrow canyon she never would have found on her own, hidden between two massive rock formations. As they descended into the protected space, Elena noticed the wind wasn't as fierce here, and the snow was lighter. Ancient petroglyphs decorated the canyon walls, and she recognized Apache symbols among the carved images. At the far end of the canyon, partially concealed by overhanging rocks and winter bare brush, Elena saw a structure that made her catch her breath. It was a traditional Apache winter shelter, constructed of logs and stones, with smoke rising from a central fire ring. Warm, light flickered from the interior, and Elena smelled wood smoke mixed with something that might have been cooking food. The painted wolf approached the shelter and disappeared around the side. Elena hesitated, her academic training warring with her desperate need for warmth and shelter. This could be someone's private property, or worse, she could be trespassing on sacred ground. But as another wave of dizziness nearly sent her to her knees, survival overrode scholarly caution. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Is anyone there? I'm lost and I need help." A figure emerged from the shelter, silhouetted against the firelight. Elena's relief was so overwhelming that her knees buckled, and she would have fallen again if strong hands hadn't caught her shoulders. "Easy now," said a gravelly voice speaking accented English. "You're safe. Let's get you inside before you freeze to death." The warmth inside the shelter hit Elena like a physical force, and she gasped as feeling began returning to her extremities. The pain of thawing fingers and toes was excruciating, but she welcomed it as a sign that she wasn't going to lose any digits to frostbite. Her rescuer, an elderly Apache man with long gray hair and weathered features, helped her settle beside the fire and began removing her wet outer clothing with practiced efficiency. "My name is Thomas B. Gay," he said, wrapping a heavy blanket around her shoulders. "And unless I'm mistaken, you're the young anthropologist who's been asking permission to study our old places." Lena's teeth chattered too violently for coherent speech, but she managed to nod. Thomas handed her a cup of something warm and herbal smelling. The liquid burned her throat, but heat spread through her chest and stomach almost immediately. "Drink, slowly," Thomas advised. "Your body needs time to remember how to be warm." As sensation returned to her limbs, Elena looked around the shelter with professional curiosity despite her condition. The structure was authentic, built using traditional methods she'd only read about in historical accounts. The walls were constructed of stacked stones and logs chinked with mud and moss. Buffalo hides and woven blankets hung from the walls, and various tools and implements were arranged with careful precision. "This is incredible," Elena managed to say between sips of the warming tea. "It's exactly like the winter shelters described in the historical records." Thomas smiled, the expression creasing his weathered face. "This shelter has been maintained by my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather built it when he was young, before the troubles with the cavalry. We've kept it ready, just in case." "Just in case of what?" "In case someone needed it," Thomas replied simply. "In case the old ways were called upon again. In case a lost person found their way here and needed to remember what it means to survive." Lena pulled the blanket tighter around herself, still shivering despite the warmth of the fire. "I saw a wolf," she said hesitantly. "It had markings painted on its fur. It led me here." Thomas nodded, as if this was perfectly normal. "She's been watching these mountains for longer than most people remember. Some say she's the spirit of an ancient healer. Others believe she's just a wolf who learned to trust the right people. I've never tried to capture her or study her. Some things are better left as mysteries. But the paint markings are real," Thomas confirmed. "Applied with natural pigments by someone who understands the old symbols. Whether that someone is human or spirit, I couldn't say. Does it matter?" Elena considered this as she continued to warm herself by the fire. Her scientific training demanded rational explanations, but sitting in this ancient shelter, saved from certain death by a painted wolf and an Apache elder who seemed to have materialized from another century, rational explanations felt less important than they had a few hours ago. "How did you know I was coming?" she asked. Thomas poked at the fire with a long stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the smoke hole in the roof. "I didn't know you specifically were coming, but I knew someone would. The signs have been building for weeks. Animals behaving strangely, changes in the wind patterns, dreams that wouldn't leave me alone. My grandmother taught me to read such things." He stood and moved to a large pot suspended over the coals. The smell that had greeted Elena earlier intensified, something rich and nourishing that made her stomach growl with sudden hunger. "Rabbit stew," Thomas said, ladling the fragrant mixture into a wooden bowl. "With wild onions and herbs I gathered, in the fall. Eat slowly. Your stomach needs to remember how to process food, just like your body needed to remember warmth." As Elena ate, Thomas told her about his role as keeper of this place. He was retired from his job as a high school teacher on the reservation, but he'd taken on the responsibility of maintaining several traditional sites that held significance for his people. This winter shelter was one of them, kept in readiness not just for emergencies but as a living connection to Apache history and culture. "The developers want this land," Thomas said, settling back beside the fire. "They've offered the tribe substantial money for mineral rights and access to build a resort. Some of our people support the deal. We need economic opportunities on the reservation, but places like this would be lost forever." Elena set down her empty bowl, feeling more human than she had since the storm began. "What will you do?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I'm old and my voice doesn't carry the weight it once did. The tribal council listens respectfully when I speak about preserving our heritage, but they also have to think about jobs and revenue. It's a difficult balance." Outside the shelter, the wind continued to howl, but inside, Elena felt a peace she hadn't experienced since beginning her research. This was what she'd been looking for, not just academic knowledge, but genuine understanding of how traditional cultures adapted and survived in challenging environments. Elena woke to the high sound of Thomas moving quietly around the shelter, adding wood to the fire, and preparing what smelled like coffee. The storm had passed during the night, and pale morning light filtered through the entrance. Her body ached from the previous day's ordeal, but she felt remarkably restored. "The weather has cleared," Thomas said. offering her a steaming cup. "But the snow is deep. It will be difficult traveling for a few days." Elena accepted the coffee gratefully, noting that it was strong and black, nothing like the herbal tea from the night before. "I should try to contact my advisor. Let people know I'm safe. My phone might work from higher ground. There's a ridge, about a mile north where you can sometimes get a signal," Thomas confirmed. "But first, let me show you something." After a breakfast of cornbread and dried fruit, Thomas led Elena to the back of the canyon, where a natural cave extended deep into the rock face. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, Elena gasped at what she saw. The cave walls were covered with petroglyphs, but these weren't ancient. They were recent additions, created with traditional techniques but depicting contemporary scenes. "I've been documenting our changing world," Thomas explained, gesturing to images that showed everything from traditional hunts to modern cars, from old ceremonies to satellite dishes. "My grandfather taught me the old ways of record-keeping. These pictures tell the story of how we've adapted while trying to preserve what matters most." Elena studied the petroglyphs with professional fascination. The work was masterful, combining traditional Apache artistic conventions with modern subject matter in ways that created a visual narrative of cultural continuity and change. "This is extraordinary," she breathed. "It's like a living historical record." "That's exactly what it is," Thomas replied. "But it's also why this place is so important. These aren't just old ruins. This is where we continue to live our culture, where we adapt our traditions to meet new challenges." They spent the morning exploring the site, with Thomas explaining the significance of various symbols and sharing stories that weren't recorded in any anthropological texts. Elena realized that her academic research, while valuable, was capturing only fragments of a much larger and more complex cultural reality. "I want to help," Elena said as they sat in the shelter during the midday heat. "With the development threat, my research could document the cultural significance of this site in ways that might carry weight with government agencies." Thomas studied her carefully. "Why would you do that? This isn't your fight and it could complicate your academic work." Elena thought about the painted wolf, about the way this place had saved her life and opened her understanding in ways she was still processing. "Because some things are more important than dissertations. Because you saved my life, and because what you're preserving here matters more than resort development." Over the next 2 days, as they waited for the snow to melt enough for safe travel, Elena and Thomas worked together to document the site comprehensively. Elena used her training in archaeological photography and recording techniques, while Thomas provided cultural context and interpretation that transformed dry academic observations into living history. They created detailed maps of the petroglyphs, both ancient and modern. Elena recorded hours of Thomas's stories and explanations, capturing not just information, but the cadence and emotion with which traditional knowledge was transmitted. Thomas, in turn, learned about Elena's world, the university bureaucracy, the academic publishing process, the ways that scholarly research could be used to support conservation efforts. "You're building a bridge," Thomas observed on their final evening together. "Between the academic world and ours, that's not easy work." Elena poked at the fire, thinking about the challenges ahead. "I'm going to need to change my dissertation focus completely. Instead of just studying historical Apache sites, I want to document how traditional cultures use and maintain these places in the present day. Your professors won't mind? Some will, others won't understand why I'm complicating what they see as straightforward historical research. But I think this approach could have real impact, especially for land use decisions." Thomas nodded slowly. "My people have always known that the old ways and the new ways don't have to be enemies. It's finding the balance that's difficult." As Elena prepared for her return to civilization, she felt changed in ways that went beyond her academic work. The experience of being lost and found, of encountering the painted wolf and this keeper of traditions, had shifted something fundamental in her understanding of what knowledge meant and how it should be used. "Will you continue maintaining this place?" she asked Thomas as they banked the fire for the night. "As long as I'm able," he replied. "And I hope someone younger will take over when I can't. That's how traditions survive, not by being preserved in museums, but by remaining alive and useful." Elena fell asleep that night to the sound of wind in the pines, thinking about painted wolves and the bridges between worlds that could be built with patience, respect, and the recognition that some knowledge was too important to remain locked in academic journals. 3 months later, Elena sat in a conference room at the University of Arizona, presenting her preliminary findings to a committee that included her advisor, 2 anthropology professors, and representatives from the National Park Service and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The PowerPoint slides showing Thomas's petroglyphs and the winter shelter created a stir that surprised even Elena with its intensity. "Dr. Ramirez," said the Park Service representative, "are you saying this site has been continuously maintained for over a century?" "That's correct," Elena replied. "The Begay family has kept this winter shelter and the associated cultural sites in active use, not as museum pieces, but as living components of their cultural practice." Her advisor, Dr. Morrison, leaned forward with obvious interest. "This changes the entire framework for how we understand Apache cultural continuity. Most scholarship assumes these traditional practices were abandoned or severely disrupted by the reservation period." Elena advanced to her next slide, which showed Thomas creating new petroglyphs using traditional techniques. "What I discovered is that adaptation and preservation aren't mutually exclusive. Mr. Begay and others like him have found ways to maintain traditional knowledge and practices while engaging with contemporary realities." The BIA representative, a middle-aged Navajo woman named Sarah Yazzie, asked, "What's the current legal status of this land?" "It's within the Coronado National Forest, but there are mineral rights issues in the ongoing development proposal," Elena explained. "The cultural significance of the site hasn't been properly documented in federal records, which makes it vulnerable to commercial exploitation." Dr. Morrison made notes as Elena continued her presentation. The committee members asked detailed questions about her methodology, her relationship with Thomas, and the implications of her findings for both academic research and cultural preservation policy. "I'm recommending a fundamental shift in how we approach anthropological research with living cultures," Elena concluded. "Instead of treating indigenous peoples as subjects of study, we should be working as partners in documenting and preserving cultural knowledge that remains active and relevant." After the formal presentation, Dr. Morrison walked with Elena across the campus. The Arizona spring was warm and dry, a stark contrast to the snow-covered mountains where Elena had nearly died 3 months earlier. "This work is going to make waves," Dr. Morrison said. "Some of my colleagues won't appreciate having their research approaches challenged so directly." "I know," Elena replied, "but I can't go back to treating culture as something dead and preserved under glass. What Thomas showed me is that traditions survive by remaining useful, by adapting to meet current needs while maintaining their essential character." Her phone buzzed with a text message from Thomas. "Development proposal rejected by Tribal Council. Your documentation made the difference. The fire continues." Elena smiled, thinking about the painted wolf she'd never seen again, but whose presence had somehow changed the trajectory of her entire career. She'd submitted her original thesis proposal in favor of a more complex project that would require years of collaborative work with Apache communities, but she knew it was the right path. That evening, Elena drove back to the Chiricahua Mountains, not as a lost graduate student, but as someone who understood that the most important knowledge couldn't be captured in academic papers alone. She found Thomas at the winter shelter, teaching 2 of his grandchildren how to identify edible plants and maintain the traditional fire that had been burning continuously since her rescue. Dr. Elena called 8-year-old Maria, Thomas's granddaughter, who had heard stories about the anthropologist who got lost in the snow. "Just Elena," she corrected gently, settling beside the fire. "I brought copies of the photographs and recordings we made. The government agencies were impressed." Thomas nodded, adding wood to the flames. "The developers will try again, probably with a different approach. but we've bought time to build stronger legal protections. As darkness fell over the canyon, Elena helped Thomas tell the children stories about their ancestors, about the ways traditional knowledge had helped people survive in challenging times, about the importance of maintaining connections between past and future. "Will you tell us about the painted wolf?" asked 10-year-old Joseph. Elena looked at Thomas, who smiled and nodded. "I was lost in a blizzard," Elena began, "and when I thought I couldn't go any further, she appeared and led me to safety. Some people might say I was hallucinating from the cold, but I know what I saw. Grandmother says the spirits help people who respect the old ways," Maria said solemnly. "Your grandmother is very wise," Elena replied, thinking about how her life had been redirected by following a mysterious guide through the snow. Later, as Elena prepared to return to town, Thomas walked with her to the canyon entrance. The night sky was brilliant with stars, unpolluted by the light of distant cities. "You've become part of this place's story now," Thomas said. "That carries responsibilities." Elena nodded, understanding that her role had evolved from researcher to ally, from observer to participant in the ongoing work of cultural preservation. "I'll keep coming back, as long as you'll have me." "The fire always needs tending," Thomas replied, "and bridges always need people willing to cross them in both directions." As Elena drove back toward Tucson, she thought about the painted wolf somewhere in the mountains, about Thomas continuing his grandfather's work, about the children learning stories that connected them to their heritage while preparing them for their own futures. The academic world she was returning to felt smaller now, but also more purposeful, connected to something larger than theoretical knowledge. Her headlights swept across the desert landscape, and for just a moment, Elena thought, she saw a flash of gray fur and amber eyes at the edge of the road. When she looked more carefully, there was nothing there but wind-sculpted rocks and the endless sweep of the Sonoran night. But she smiled anyway, knowing that some guides appeared when they were needed most, and that the fire Thomas tended would continue burning long after both of them were gone, maintained by those who understood that traditions survive not by being preserved unchanged, but by remaining alive and useful in a changing world.